I have been away a long time, and I have had no news of this place since I left. Is there anything to tell, Father? Has any discovery been made, any suspicion developed as to the other?" The priest shook his head. "Not a word, not a whisper. It is a mystery. It always will be." Vanamee clasped his head between his clenched fists, rocking himself to and fro. "Oh, the terror of it," he murmured, "the horror of it. And she, think of it, Sarria, only 16, a little girl, so innocent that she never knew what wrong meant, pure as a little child is pure, who believed that all things were good, mature only in her love. And to be struck down like that, while your God looked down from heaven and would not take her part." All at once he seemed to lose control of himself. One of those furies of impotent grief and wrath that assailed him from time to time, blind, insensate, incoherent, suddenly took possession of him. A torrent of words issued from his lips, and he flung out an arm, the fist clenched in a fierce, quick gesture, partly of despair, partly of defiance, partly of supplication. No, your God would not take her part. Where was God's mercy in that? Where was heaven's protection in that? Where was the loving kindness you preach about? Why did God give her life if it was to be stamped out? Why did God give her the power of love if it was to come to nothing? Sarria, listen to me. Why did God make her so divinely pure if he permitted that abomination? Ah, he exclaimed bitterly, your God! Why, an Apache buck would have been more merciful. Your God! There is no God. There is only the devil. The heaven you pray to is only a joke, a wretched trick, a delusion. It is only hell that is real. Sarria caught him by the arm. "You are a fool and a child," he exclaimed, "and it is blasphemy that you are saying. I forbid it. You understand? I forbid it." Vanamee turned on him with a sudden cry. "Then tell your God to give her back to me." Sarria started away from him, his eyes widening in astonishment, surprised out of all composure by the other's outburst. Vanamee's swarthy face was pale, the sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes were marked with great black shadows. The priest no longer recognized him. The face, that face of the ascetic, lean, framed in its long black hair and pointed beard, was quivering with the excitement of hallucination. It was the face of the inspired shepherds of the Hebraic legends, living close to nature, the younger prophets of Israel, dwellers in the wilderness, solitary, imaginative, believing in the vision, having strange delusions, gifted with strange powers. In a brief second of thought, Sarria understood. Out into the wilderness, the vast arid desert of the southwest, Vanamee had carried his grief. For days, for weeks, months even, he had been alone, a solitary speck lost in the immensity of the horizons. Continually he was brooding, haunted with his sorrow, thinking, often hard put to it for food. The body was ill-nourished, and the mind, concentrated forever upon one subject, had recoiled upon itself, had preyed upon the naturally nervous temperament, till the imagination had become exalted, morbidly active, diseased, beset with hallucinations, forever in search of the manifestation of the miracle. It was small wonder that, bringing a fancy so distorted back to the scene of a vanished happiness, Vanamee should be racked with the most violent illusions, beset in the throes of a veritable hysteria. "Tell your God to give her back to me," he repeated with fierce insistence. It was the pitch of mysticism, the imagination harassed and goaded beyond the normal round, suddenly flipping from the circumference, spinning off at a tangent, out into the void, where all things seemed possible, hurtling through the dark there, groping for the supernatural, clamoring for the miracle. And it was also the human, natural protest against the inevitable, the irrevocable, the spasm of revolt under the sting of death, the rebellion of the soul at the victory of the grave. "He can give her back to me if he only will," Vanamee cried. "Sarria, you must help me. I tell you, I warn you, sir, I can't last much longer under it. My head is all wrong with it. I've no more hold on my mind. Something must happen, or I shall lose my senses. I am breaking down under it all, my body and my mind alike. Bring her to me. Make God show her to me. If all tales are true, it would not be the first time. If I cannot have her, at least let me see her as she was, real, earthly, not her spirit, her ghost. I want her real self undefiled again. If this is dementia, then let me be demented. But help me, you and your God. Create the delusion. Do the miracle." "Stop!" cried the priest again, shaking him roughly by the shoulder. "Stop! Be yourself. This is dementia." "But I shall not let you be demented. Think of what you are saying. Bring her back to you? Is that the way of God? I thought you were a man. This is the talk of a weak-minded girl." Vanamee stirred abruptly in his place, drawing a long breath and looking about him vaguely, as if he came to himself. "You are right," he muttered. "I hardly know what I am saying at times. But there are moments when my whole mind and soul seem to rise up in rebellion against what has happened, when it seems to me that I am stronger than death, and that if I only knew how to use the strength of my will, concentrate my power of thought, volition, that I could, I don't know, not call her back, but something." "A diseased and distorted mind is capable of hallucinations, if that is what you mean," observed Sarria. "Perhaps that is what I mean. Perhaps I want only the delusion after all." Sarria did not reply, and there was a long silence. In the damp south corners of the walls a frog began to croak at exact intervals. The little fountain rippled monotonously, and a magnolia flower dropped from one of the trees, falling straight as a plummet through the motionless air and settling upon the gravelled walk with a faint rustling sound. Otherwise the stillness was profound. A little later the priest's cigar, long since out, slipped from his fingers to the ground. He began to nod gently. Vanamee touched his arm. "Asleep, sir?" The other started, rubbing his eyes. "Upon my word, I believe I was." "Better go to bed, sir. I am not tired. I think I shall sit out here a little longer." "Well, perhaps I would be better off in bed. Your bed is always ready for you here, whenever you want to use it." "No, I shall go back to Quien-Sabe later. Good night, sir." "Good night, my boy." Vanamee was left alone. For a long time he sat motionless in his place, his elbows on his knees, his chin propped in his hands. The minutes passed, then the hours. The moon climbed steadily higher among the stars. Vanamee rolled and smoked cigarette after cigarette, the blue haze of smoke hanging motionless above his head, or drifting in slowly weaving filaments across the open spaces of the garden. But the influence of the old enclosure, this corner of romance and mystery, this isolated garden of dreams, savouring of the past, with its legends, its graves, its crumbling sundial, its fountain with its rime of moss, was not to be resisted. Now that the priest had left him, the same exaltation of spirit that had seized upon Vanamee earlier in the evening by degrees grew big again in his mind and imagination. His sorrow assaulted him like the flagellations of a fine whiplash, and his love for Angele rose again in his heart. It seemed to him never so deep, so tender, so infinitely strong. No doubt it was his familiarity with the mission garden, his clear-cut remembrance of it, as it was in the days when he had met Angele there, tallying now so exactly with the reality there under his eyes that brought her to his imagination so vividly. And yet he dared not trust himself near her grave. But for the moment he rose, and his hands clasped behind him, walked slowly from point to point amid the tiny gravelled walks, recalling the incidents of 18 years ago. On the bench he had quitted, he and Angele had often sat. Here by the crumbling sundial he recalled the night when he had kissed her for the first time. Here again by the rim of the fountain, with its fringe of green, she once had paused, and baring her arm to the shoulder, had thrust it deep into the water, and then, withdrawing it, had given it to him to kiss, all wet and cool. And here, at last, under the shadow of the pear trees, they had sat, evening after evening, looking off over the little valley below them, watching the night build itself, dome-like, from horizon to zenith. Brusquely, Vanamee turned away from the prospect. The seed ranch was dark at this time of the year, and flowerless. Far off toward its center he had caught a brief glimpse of the house where Angele had lived, and a faint light burning in its window. But he turned from it sharply. The deep-seated travail of his grief abruptly reached the paroxysm. With long strides he crossed the garden and re-entered the mission church itself, plunging into the coolness of its atmosphere as into a bath. What he searched for he did not know, or rather did not define. He knew only that he was suffering, that a longing for Angele, for some object around which his great love could enfold itself, was tearing at his heart with iron teeth. He was ready to be deluded, craved the hallucination, begged pitifully for the illusion, anything rather than the empty, tenantless night, the voiceless silence, the vast loneliness of the overspanning arc of the heavens. Before the chancel rail of the altar, under the sanctuary lamp, Vanamee sank upon his knees, his arms folded upon the rail, his head bowed down upon them. He prayed, with what words he could not say, for what he did not understand, for help merely, for relief, for an answer to his cry. It was upon that, at length, that his disordered mind concentrated itself. An answer. He demanded, he implored an answer. Not a vague visitation of grace, not a formless sense of peace, but an answer, something real, even if the reality were fancied, a voice out of the night, responding to his, a hand in the dark, clasping his groping fingers, a breath, human, warm, fragrant, familiar, like a soft, sweet caress on his shrunken cheeks. Alone there in the dim half-light of the decaying mission, with its crumbling plaster, its naive crudity of ornament and picture, he wrestled fiercely with his desires. Words, fragments of sentences, inarticulate, incoherent, wrenched from his tight-shut teeth. But the answer was not in the church. Above him, over the high altar, the Virgin in a glory with downcast eyes and folded hands grew vague and indistinct in the shadow, the colors fading, tarnished by centuries of incense smoke. The Christ in agony on the cross was but a lamentable vision of tormented anatomy, gray flesh spotted with crimson. The St. John, the San Juan Bautista, patron saint of the mission, the gaunt figure in skins, 2 fingers upraised in the gesture of benediction, gazed stolidly out into the half-gloom under the ceiling, ignoring the human distress that beat itself in vain against the altar rail below, and Angele remained, as before, only a memory, far distant, intangible, lost. Vanamee rose, turning his back upon the altar with a vague gesture of despair. He crossed the church, and issuing from the low arched door opposite the pulpit, once more stepped out into the garden. Here at last was reality. The warm, still air descended upon him like a cloak, grateful, comforting, dispelling the chill that lurked in the damp mold of plaster and crumbling adobe. But now he found his way across the garden on the other side of the fountain, where, ranged against the eastern wall, were 9 graves. Here Angele was buried, in the smallest grave of them all, marked by the little headstone, with its 2 dates, only 16 years apart. To this spot, at last, he had returned, after the years spent in the desert, the wilderness, after all the wanderings of the long trail. Here, if ever, he must have a sense of her nearness. Close at hand, a short 4 feet under that mound of grass, was the form he had so often held in the embrace of his arms. The face, the very face he had kissed, that face with the hair of gold making 3-cornered the round white forehead, the violet blue eyes, heavy-lidded, with their strange oriental slant upward toward the temples, the sweet, full lips, almost Egyptian in their fullness, all that strange, perplexing, wonderful beauty, so troublous, so enchanting, so out of all accepted standards. He bent down, dropping upon one knee, a hand upon the headstone, and read again the inscription. Then, instinctively, his hand left the stone and rested upon the low mound of turf, touching it with the softness of a caress. And then, before he was aware of it, he was stretched at full length upon the earth, beside the grave, his arms about the low mound, his lips pressed against the grass with which it was covered. The pent-up grief of nearly 20 years rose again within his heart, and overflowed, irresistible, violent, passionate. There was no one to see, no one to hear. Vanamee had no thought of restraint. He no longer wrestled with his pain, strove against it. There was even a sense of relief in permitting himself to be overcome. But the reaction from this outburst was equally violent. His revolt against the inevitable, his protest against the grave, shook him from head to foot, goaded him beyond all bounds of reason, hounded him on and into the domain of hysteria, dementia. Vanamee was no longer master of himself, no longer knew what he was doing. At first he had been content with merely a wild, unreasoned cry to heaven that Onele should be restored to him. But the vast egotism that seems to run through all forms of disordered intelligence gave his fancy another turn. He forgot God. He no longer reckoned with heaven. He arrogated their powers to himself, struggled to be, of his own unaided thought, stronger than death, more powerful than the grave. He had demanded of Sarria that God should restore Onele to him, but now he appealed directly to Onele herself. As he lay there, his arms clasped about her grave, she seemed so near to him that he fancied she must hear. And suddenly, at this moment, his recollection of his strange, compelling power, the same power by which he had called Presley to him halfway across the Quien-Sabe ranch, the same power which had brought Sarria to his side that very evening, recurred to him. Concentrating his mind upon the one object with which it had so long been filled, Vanamee, his eyes closed, his face buried in his arms, exclaimed, "Come to me, Onele! Don't you hear? Come to me!" But the answer was not in the grave. Below him the voiceless earth lay silent, moveless, withholding the secret, jealous of that which it held so close in its grip, refusing to give up that which had been confided to its keeping, untouched by the human anguish that above there, on its surface, clutched with despairing hands at a grave long made. The earth that only that morning had been so eager, so responsive to the lightest summons, so vibrant with life, now at night, holding death within its embrace, guarding inviolate the secret of the grave, was deaf to all entreaty, refused the answer, and Onele remained as before, only a memory, far distant, intangible, lost. Vanamee lifted his head, looking about him with unseeing eyes, trembling with the exertion of his vain effort. But he could not as yet allow himself to despair. Never before had that curious power of attraction failed him. He felt himself to be so strong in this respect that he was persuaded if he exerted himself to the limit of his capacity, something, he could not say what, must come of it. If it was only a self-delusion, an hallucination, he told himself that he would be content. Almost of its own accord, his distorted mind concentrated itself again, every thought, all the power of his will, riveting themselves upon Onele. As if she were alive, he summoned her to him. His eyes, fixed upon the name cut into the headstone, contracted, the pupils growing small, his fists shut tight, his nerves braced rigid. For a few seconds he stood thus, breathless, expectant, awaiting the manifestation, the miracle. Then, without knowing why, hardly conscious of what was transpiring, he found that his glance was leaving the headstone, was turning from the grave. Not only this, but his whole body was following the direction of his eyes. Before he knew it, he was standing with his back to Onele's grave, was facing the north, facing the line of pear trees, and the little valley where the seed ranch lay. At first he thought this was because he had allowed his will to weaken, the concentrated power of his mind to grow slack. And once more, turning towards the grave, he banded all his thoughts together in a consummate effort, his teeth grinding together, his hands pressed to his forehead. He forced himself to the notion that Onele was alive, and to this creature of his imagination he addressed himself. "Onele," he cried in a low voice, "Onele, I am calling you. Do you hear? Come to me. Come to me now. Now." Instead of the answer he demanded, that inexplicable counter-influence cut across the current of his thought. Strive as he would against it, he must veer to the north, toward the pear trees. Obeying it, he turned, and still wondering, took a step in that direction, then another and another. The next moment he came abruptly to himself in the black shadow of the pear trees themselves, and opening his eyes found himself looking over the seed ranch, toward the little house in the center where Onele had once lived. Perplexed, he returned to the grave, once more calling upon the resources of his will, and abruptly, so soon as these reached a certain point, the same cross-current set in. He could no longer keep his eyes upon the headstone, could no longer think of the grave and what it held. He must face the north. He must be drawn toward the pear trees, and there left standing in their shadow, looking out aimlessly over the seed ranch, wondering, bewildered. Farther than this the influence never drew him, but up to this point, the line of pear trees, it was not to be resisted. For a time the peculiarity of the affair was of more interest to Vanamee than even his own distress of spirit, and once or twice he repeated the attempt, almost experimentally, and invariably with the same result. So soon as he seemed to hold Angele in the grip of his mind, he was moved to turn about toward the north and hurry toward the pear trees on the crest of the hill that overlooked the little valley. But Vanamee's unhappiness was too keen this night for him to dwell long upon the vagaries of his mind. Submitting at length, and abandoning the grave, he flung himself down in the black shade of the pear trees, his chin in his hands, and resigned himself finally and definitely to the inrush of recollection and the exquisite grief of an infinite regret. To his fancy she came to him again. He put himself back many years. He remembered the warm nights of July and August, profoundly still, the sky encrusted with stars, the little mission garden exhaling the mingled perfumes that all through the scorching day had been distilled under the steady blaze of a summer sun. He saw himself as another person, arriving at this, their rendezvous. All day long she had been in his mind. All day long he had looked forward to this quiet hour that belonged to her. It was dark. He could see nothing, but by and by he heard a step, a gentle rustle of the grass on the slope of the hill pressed under an advancing foot. Then he saw the faint gleam of pallid gold of her hair, a barely visible glow in the starlight, and heard the murmur of her breath in the lapse of the overpassing breeze. And then, in the midst of the gentle perfumes of the garden, the perfumes of the magnolia flowers, of the mignonette borders, of the crumbling walls, there expanded a new odor, or the faint mingling of many odors, the smell of the roses that lingered in her hair, of the lilies that exhaled from her neck, of the heliotrope that disengaged itself from her hands and arms, and of the hyacinths with which her little feet were redolent. And then, suddenly, it was herself, her eyes heavy-lidded, violet blue, full of the love of him, her sweet, full lips speaking his name, her hands clasping his hands, his shoulders, his neck, her whole dear body giving itself into his embrace, her lips against his, her hands holding his head, drawing his face down to hers. Vanamee, as he remembered all this, flung out an arm with a cry of pain, his eyes searching the gloom, all his mind in strenuous mutiny against the triumph of death. His glance shot swiftly out across the night, unconsciously following the direction from which Angele used to come to him. "Come to me now," he exclaimed under his breath, tense and rigid with the vast futile effort of his will. "Come to me now, now! Don't you hear me, Angele? You must come!" Suddenly Vanamee returned to himself with the abruptness of a blow. His eyes opened. He half raised himself from the ground. Swiftly his scattered wits readjusted themselves. Never more sane, never more himself, he rose to his feet and stood looking off into the night across the seed ranch. "What was it?" he murmured, bewildered. He looked around him from side to side, as if to get in touch with reality once more. He looked at his hands, at the rough bark of the pear tree next which he stood, at the streaked and rain-eroded walls of the mission and garden. The exaltation of his mind calmed itself. The unnatural strain under which he labored slackened. He became thoroughly master of himself again, matter-of-fact, practical, keen. But just so sure as his hands were his own, just so sure as the bark of the pear tree was rough, the moldering adobe of the mission walls damp, just so sure had something occurred. It was vague, intangible, appealing only to some strange, nameless sixth sense, but none the less perceptible. His mind, his imagination, sent out from him across the night, across the little valley below him, speeding hither and thither through the dark, lost, confused, had suddenly paused, hovering, had found something. It had not returned to him empty-handed. It had come back, but now there was a change, mysterious, elusive. There were no words for this that had transpired. But for the moment one thing only was certain. The night was no longer voiceless. The dark was no longer empty. Far off there, beyond the reach of vision, unlocalized, strange, a ripple had formed on the still black pool of the night. Had formed, flashed one instant to the stars, then swiftly faded again. The night shut down once more. There was no sound, nothing stirred. For the moment Vanamee stood transfixed, struck rigid in his place, stupefied, his eyes staring breathless with utter amazement. Then step by step he shrank back into the deeper shadow, treading with the infinite precaution of a prowling leopard. A qualm of something very much like fear seized upon him. But immediately on the heels of this first impression came the doubt of his own senses. Whatever had happened had been so ephemeral, so faint, so intangible, that now he wondered if he had not deceived himself after all. But the reaction followed. Surely there had been something. And from that moment began for him the most poignant uncertainty of mind. Gradually he drew back into the garden, holding his breath, listening to every faintest sound, walking upon tiptoe. He reached the fountain, and, wetting his hands, passed them across his forehead and eyes. Once more he stood listening. The silence was profound. Troubled, disturbed, Vanamee went away, passing out of the garden, descending the hill. He forded Broderson Creek, where it intersected the road to Guadalajara, and went on across Quien-Sabe, walking slowly, his head bent down, his hands clasped behind his back, thoughtful, perplexed. Chapter 5. At 7 o'clock, in the bedroom of his ranch house, in the white-painted iron bedstead with its blue-gray army blankets and red counterpane, Annixter was still asleep, his face red, his mouth open, his stiff yellow hair in wild disorder. On the wooden chair at the bed head stood the kerosene lamp, by the light of which he had been reading the previous evening. Beside it was a paper bag of dried prunes and the limp volume of Copperfield, the place marked by a slip of paper torn from the edge of the bag. Annixter slept soundly, making great work of the business, unable to take even his rest gracefully. His eyes were shut so tight that the skin at their angles was drawn into puckers. Under his pillow his two hands were doubled up into fists. At intervals he gritted his teeth ferociously, while from time to time the abrupt sound of his snoring dominated the brisk ticking of the alarm clock that hung from the brass knob of the bedpost within 6 inches of his ear. But immediately after 7 this clock sprung its alarm with the abruptness of an explosion, and within the second Annixter had hurled the bedclothes from him and flung himself up to a sitting posture on the edge of the bed, panting and gasping, blinking at the light, rubbing his head, dazed and bewildered, stupefied at the hideous suddenness with which he had been wrenched from his sleep. His first act was to take down the alarm clock and stifle its prolonged whirring under the pillows and blankets. But when this had been done, he continued to sit stupidly on the edge of the bed, curling his toes away from the cold of the floor. His half-shut eyes, heavy with sleep, fixed and vacant, closing and opening by turns. For upwards of 3 minutes he alternately dozed and woke, his head and the whole upper half of his body sagging abruptly sideways from moment to moment. But at length, coming more to himself, he straightened up, ran his fingers through his hair, and with a prodigious yawn murmured vaguely, "Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord!" He stretched 3 or 4 times, twisting about in his place, curling and uncurling his toes, muttering from time to time between 2 yawns, "Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord!" He stared about the room, collecting his thoughts, readjusting himself for the day's work. The room was barren, the walls of tongue and groove sheathing, alternate brown and yellow boards, like the walls of a stable, were adorned with 2 or 3 unframed lithographs, the Christmas souvenirs of weekly periodicals, fastened with great wire nails. A bunch of herbs or flowers, lamentably withered and gray with dust, was affixed to the mirror over the black walnut washstand by the window, and a yellowed photograph of Annixter's combined harvester, himself and his men in a group before it, hung close at hand. On the floor, at the bedside and before the bureau, were 2 oval rag carpet rugs. In the corners of the room were muddy boots, a McClellan saddle, a surveyor's transit, an empty coal hod, and a box of iron bolts and nuts. On the wall over the bed, in a gilt frame, was Annixter's college diploma, while on the bureau, amid a litter of hairbrushes, dirty collars, driving gloves, cigars, and the like, stood a broken machine for loading shells. It was essentially a man's room, rugged, uncouth, virile, full of the odors of tobacco, of leather, of rusty iron. The bare floor hollowed by the grind of hob-nailed boots, the walls marred by the friction of heavy things of metal. Strangely enough, Annixter's clothes were disposed of on the single chair with the precision of an old maid. Thus he had placed them the night before, the boots set carefully side by side, the trousers with the overalls still upon them neatly folded upon the seat of the chair, the coat hanging from its back. The Kiansabe ranch house was a 6-room affair, all on one floor. By no excess of charity could it have been called a home. Annixter was a wealthy man. He could have furnished his dwelling with quite as much elegance as that of Magnus Derrick. As it was, however, he considered his house merely as a place to eat, to sleep, to change his clothes in, as a shelter from the rain, an office where business was transacted, nothing more. When he was sufficiently awake, Annixter thrust his feet into a pair of wicker slippers and shuffled across the office adjoining his bedroom to the bathroom just beyond, and stood under the icy shower a few minutes, his teeth chattering, fulminating oaths at the coldness of the water. Still shivering, he hurried into his clothes, and, having pushed the button of the electric bell to announce that he was ready for breakfast, immediately plunged into the business of the day. While he was thus occupied, the butcher's cart from Bonneville drove into the yard with the day's supply of meat. This cart also brought the Bonneville paper and the mail of the previous night. In the bundle of correspondence that the butcher handed to Annixter that morning was a telegram from Osterman, at that time on his second trip to Los Angeles. It read, "Flotation of company in this district assured. Have secured services of desirable party. Am now in position to sell you your share stock as per original plan." Annixter grunted as he tore the dispatch into strips. "Well," he muttered, "that part is settled, then." He made a little pile of the torn strips on the top of the unlighted stove and burned them carefully, scowling down into the flicker of fire, thoughtful and preoccupied. He knew very well what Osterman referred to by flotation of company, and also who was the desirable party he spoke of. Under protest, as he was particular to declare, and after interminable argument, Annixter had allowed himself to be reconciled with Osterman and to be persuaded to re-enter the proposed political deal. A committee had been formed to finance the affair, Osterman, old Broderson, Annixter himself, and, with reservations hardly more than a looker-on, Harron Derrick. Of this committee, Osterman was considered chairman. Magnus Derrick had formally and definitely refused his adherence to the scheme. He was trying to steer a middle course. His position was difficult, anomalous. If freight rates were cut through the efforts of the members of the committee, he could not very well avoid taking advantage of the new schedule. He would be the gainer, though sharing neither the risk nor the expense. But meanwhile the days were passing. The primary elections were drawing nearer. The committee could not afford to wait, and by way of a beginning, Osterman had gone to Los Angeles, fortified by a large sum of money, a purse to which Annixter, Broderson, and himself had contributed. He had put himself in touch with Disbrow, the political man of the Denver, Pueblo, and Mojave Road, and had had 2 interviews with him. The telegram that Annixter received that morning was to say that Disbrow had been bought over and would adopt Darrell as the D.P.&M candidate for railroad commissioner from the 3rd District. One of the cooks brought up Annixter's breakfast that morning, and he went through it hastily, reading his mail at the same time and glancing over the pages of the Mercury, Genslinger's paper. The Mercury, Annixter was persuaded, received a subsidy from the Pacific and Southwestern Railroad, and was hardly better than the mouthpiece by which Shelgrim and the General Office spoke to ranchers about Bonneville. An editorial in that morning's issue said, It would not be surprising to the well-informed if the long-deferred regrade of the value of the railroad sections included in the Los Muertos, Quien-Sabe, Osterman, and Broderson properties was made before the first of the year. Naturally, the tenants of these lands feel an interest in the price which the railroad will put upon its holdings, and it is rumored they expect the land will be offered to them for $2.50 per acre. It needs no seventh daughter of a seventh daughter to foresee that these gentlemen will be disappointed. "Rot!" vociferated Annixter to himself as he finished. He rolled the paper into a wad and hurled it from him. "Rot! Rot! What does Genslinger know about it? I stand on my agreement with the P&S.W. From $2.50 to $5 an acre. There it is in black and white. The road is obligated. And my improvements, I made the land valuable by improving it, irrigating it, draining it, and cultivating it. Talk to me. I know better." The most abiding impression that Genslinger's editorial made upon him was that possibly the Mercury was not subsidized by the corporation after all. If it was, Genslinger would not have been led into making his mistake as to the value of the land. He would have known that the railroad was under contract to sell at $2.50 an acre, and not only this, but when the land was put upon the market, it was to be offered to the present holders first of all. Annixter called to mind the explicit terms of the agreement between himself and the railroad, and dismissed the matter from his mind. He lit a cigar, put on his hat, and went out. The morning was fine, the air nimble, brisk. On the summit of the skeleton-like tower of the artesian well, the windmill was turning steadily in a breeze from the southwest. The water in the irrigating ditch was well up. There was no cloud in the sky. Far off to the east and west, the bulwarks of the valley, the coast range, and the foothills of the Sierra stood out, pale amethyst against the delicate pink and white sheen of the horizon. The sunlight was a veritable flood, crystal, limpid, sparkling, setting a feeling of gaiety in the air, stirring up an effervescence in the blood, a tumult of exuberance in the veins. But on his way to the barns, Annixter was obliged to pass by the open door of the dairy house. Hilma Tree was inside, singing at her work, her voice of a velvety huskiness, more of the chest than of the throat, mingling with the liquid dashing of the milk in the vats and churns, and the clear, sonorous clinking of the cans and pans. Annixter turned into the dairy house, pausing on the threshold, looking about him. Hilma stood bathed from head to foot in the torrent of sunlight that poured in upon her from the 3 wide-open windows. She was charming, delicious, radiant of youth, of health, of well-being. Into her eyes, wide open, brown-rimmed with their fine, thin line of intense black lashes, the sun set a diamond flash. The same golden light glowed all around her thick, moist hair, lambent, beautiful, a sheen of almost metallic luster, and reflected itself upon her wet lips, moving with the words of her singing. The whiteness of her skin under the caress of this hale, vigorous morning light was dazzling, pure, of a fineness beyond words. Beneath the sweet modulation of her chin, the reflected light from the burnished copper vessel she was carrying set a vibration of pale gold. Overlaying the flush of rose in her cheeks, seen only when she stood against the sunlight, was a faint sheen of down, a lustrous floss, delicate as the pollen of a flower or the impalpable powder of a moth's wing. She was moving to and fro about her work, alert, joyous, robust, and from all the fine, full amplitude of her figure, from her thick white neck sloping downward to her shoulders, from the deep feminine swell of her breast, the vigorous maturity of her hips, there was disengaged a vibrant note of gaiety, of exuberant animal life, sane, honest, strong. She wore a skirt of plain blue calico and a shirt-waist of pink linen, clean, trim, while her sleeves, turned back to the shoulders, showed her large white arms, wet with milk, redolent and fragrant with milk, glowing and resplendent in the early morning light. On the threshold, Annixter took off his hat. "Good morning, Miss Hilma." Hilma, who had set down the copper can on top of the vat, turned about quickly. "Oh, good morning, sir," and unconsciously she made a little gesture of salutation with her hand, raising it part way toward her head, as a man would have done. "Well," began Annixter vaguely, "how are you getting along down here?" "Oh, very fine. Today there is not so much to do. We drew the whey hours ago, and now we are just done putting the curd to press. I have been cleaning. See my pans? Wouldn't they do for mirrors, sir? And the copper things I have scrubbed and scrubbed. Oh, you can look into the tiniest corners, everywhere, and you won't find so much as the littlest speck of dirt or grease. I love clean things, and this room is my own particular place. Here I can do just as I please, and that is to keep the cement floor and the vats and the churns and the separators and especially the cans and coppers clean. Clean, and to see that the milk is pure, oh, so that a little baby could drink it, and to have the air always sweet, and the sun, oh, lots and lots of sun, morning, noon, and afternoon, so that everything shines. You know, I never see the sun set that it doesn't make me a little sad. Yes, always, just a little. Isn't it funny? I should want it to be day all the time. And when the day is gloomy and dark, I am just as sad as if a very good friend of mine had left me. Would you believe it? Just until within a few years, when I was a big girl, 16 and over, Mamma had to sit by my bed every night before I could go to sleep. I was afraid in the dark. Sometimes I am now. Just imagine, and now I am 19, a young lady." "You were, eh?" observed Annixter, for the sake of saying something. "Afraid in the dark. What of, ghosts?" "No, I don't know what. I wanted the light. I wanted—" She drew a deep breath, turning towards the window and spreading her pink fingertips to the light. "Oh, the sun. I love the sun. See, put your hand there, here on the top of the vat, like that. Isn't it warm? Isn't it fine? And don't you love to see it coming in like that through the windows, floods of it, and all the little dust in it shining? Where there is lots of sunlight, I think the people must be very good. It's only wicked people that love the dark. And the wicked things are always done and planned in the dark, I think. Perhaps, too, that's why I hate things that are mysterious, things that I can't see, that happen in the dark." She wrinkled her nose with a little expression of aversion. "I hate a mystery. Maybe that's why I am afraid in the dark, or was. I shouldn't like to think that anything could happen around me that I couldn't see or understand or explain." She ran on from subject to subject, positively garrulous, talking in her low-pitched voice of velvety huskiness for the mere enjoyment of putting her ideas into speech, innocently assuming that they were quite as interesting to others as to herself. She was yet a great child, ignoring the fact that she had ever grown up, taking a child's interest in her immediate surroundings, direct, straightforward, plain. While speaking, she continued about her work, rinsing out the cans with a mixture of hot water and soda, scouring them bright, and piling them in the sunlight on top of the vat. Obliquely, and from between his narrowed lids, Annixter scrutinized her from time to time, more and more won over by her adorable freshness, her clean, fine youth. The clumsiness that he usually experienced in the presence of women was wearing off. Hilma Tree's direct simplicity put him at his ease. He began to wonder if he dared to kiss Hilma, and if he did dare, how would she take it? A spark of suspicion flickered up in his mind. Did not her manner imply, vaguely, an invitation? One never could tell with females. That was why she was talking so much, no doubt, holding him there, affording the opportunity. Aha! She had best look out, or he would take her at her word. "Oh, I had forgotten," suddenly exclaimed Hilma, "the very thing I wanted to show you, the new press. You remember I asked for one last month? This is it. See, this is how it works. Here is where the curds go. Look. And this cover is screwed down like this, and then you work the lever this way." She grasped the lever in both hands, throwing her weight upon it, her smooth, bare arm swelling round and firm with the effort. One slim foot, in its low shoe set off with the bright steel buckle, braced against the wall. "My, but that takes strength," she panted, looking up at him and smiling. "But isn't it a fine press? Just what we needed." "And," Annixter cleared his throat, "and where do you keep the cheeses and the butter?" He thought it very likely that these were in the cellar of the dairy. "In the cellar," answered Hilma. "Down here, see?" She raised the flap of the cellar door at the end of the room. "And," Annixter cleared his throat, "and where do you keep the cheeses and the butter?" He thought it very likely that these were in the cellar of the dairy. "In the cellar," answered Hilma. "Down here, see?" She raised the flap of the cellar door at the end of the room. "Would you like to see? Come down, I'll show you." She went down before him into the cool obscurity underneath, redolent of new cheese and fresh butter. Annixter followed, a certain excitement beginning to gain upon him. He was almost sure now that Hilma wanted him to kiss her. At all events, one could but try. But as yet he was not absolutely sure. Suppose he had been mistaken in her? Suppose she should consider herself insulted, and freeze him with an icy stare? Annixter winced at the very thought of it. Better let the whole business go and get to work. He was wasting half the morning. Yet if she did want to give him the opportunity of kissing her, and he failed to take advantage of it, what a ninny she would think him. She would despise him for being afraid. He afraid? He, Annixter, afraid of a fool female girl? Why, he owed it to himself as a man to go as far as he could. He told himself that goat Osterman would have kissed Hilma Tree weeks ago. To test his state of mind, he imagined himself as having decided to kiss her, after all, and at once was surprised to experience a poignant qualm of excitement, his heart beating heavily, his breath coming short. At the same time his courage remained with him. He was not afraid to try. He felt a greater respect for himself because of this. His self-assurance hardened within him, and as Hilma turned to him, asking him to taste a cut from one of the ripe cheeses, he suddenly stepped close to her, throwing an arm about her shoulders, advancing his head. But at the last second he bungled, hesitated. Hilma shrank from him, supple as a young reed. Annixter clutched harshly at her arm and trod his full weight upon one of her slender feet, his cheek and chin barely touching the delicate pink lobe of one of her ears, his lips brushing merely a fold of her shirt-waist between neck and shoulder. The thing was a failure, and at once he realized that nothing had been further from Hilma's mind than the idea of his kissing her. She started back from him abruptly, her hands nervously clasped against her breast, drawing in her breath sharply and holding it with a little tremulous catch of the throat that sent a quivering vibration the length of her smooth white neck. Her eyes opened wide with a childlike look, more of astonishment than anger. She was surprised out of all measure, discountenanced, taken all aback, and when she found her breath, gave voice to a great "Oh!" of dismay and distress. For an instant Annixter stood awkwardly in his place, ridiculous, clumsy, murmuring over and over again, Well, that's all right. Who's going to hurt you? You needn't be afraid. Who's going to hurt you? That's all right." Then suddenly, with a quick, indefinite gesture of one arm, he exclaimed, "Goodbye. I'm sorry." He turned away, striding up the stairs, crossing the dairy room, and regained the open air, raging and furious. He turned toward the barns, clapping his hat upon his head, muttering the while under his breath, "Oh, you goat, you beastly fool Pip! Good Lord, what an ass you've made of yourself now!" Suddenly he resolved to put Hilma Tree out of his thoughts. The matter was interfering with his work. This kind of thing was sure not earning any money. He shook himself as though freeing his shoulders of an irksome burden, and turned his entire attention to the work nearest at hand. The prolonged rattle of the shingler's hammers upon the roof of the big barn attracted him, and crossing over between the ranch house and the artesian well, he stood for some time absorbed in the contemplation of the vast building, amused and interested with the confusion of sounds, the clatter of hammers, the cadenced scrape of saws, and the rhythmic shuffle of planes that issued from the gang of carpenters who were at that moment putting the finishing touches upon the roof and rows of stalls. A boy and two men were busy hanging the great sliding door at the south end, while the painters, come down from Bonneville early that morning, were engaged in adjusting the spray and force engine, by means of which Annixter had insisted upon painting the vast surfaces of the barn, condemning the uses of brushes and pots for such work as old-fashioned and out of date. He called to one of the foremen to ask when the barn would be entirely finished, and was told that at the end of the week the hay and stock could be installed. "And a precious long time you've been at it, too," Annixter declared. "Well, you know the rain." "Oh, rot the rain. I work in the rain. You and your unions make me sick." "But, Mr. Annixter, we couldn't have begun painting in the rain. The job would have been spoiled." "Oh, yes, spoiled. That's all very well. Maybe it would, and then again maybe it wouldn't." But when the foreman had left him, Annixter could not forbear a growl of satisfaction. It could not be denied that the barn was superb, monumental even. Almost any one of the other barns in the country could be swung birdcage fashion inside of it, with room to spare. In every sense, the barn was precisely what Annixter had hoped of it. In his pleasure over the success of his idea, even Hilma, for the moment, was forgotten. "And now," murmured Annixter, "I'll give that dance in it. I'll make 'em sit up." It occurred to him that he had better set about sending out the invitations for the affair. He was puzzled to decide just how the thing should be managed, and resolved that it might be as well to consult Magnus and Mrs. Derrick. "I want to talk of this telegram of the goats with Magnus anyhow," he said to himself reflectively, "and there's things I got to do in Bonneville before the 1st of the month." He turned about on his heel with a last look at the barn and set off toward the stable. He had decided to have his horse saddled and ride over to Bonneville by way of Los Muertos. He would make a day of it, would see Magnus, Harron, old Broderson, and some of the businessmen of Bonneville. A few moments later he rode out of the barn in the stable-yard, a fresh cigar between his teeth, his hat slanted over his face against the rays of the sun, as yet low in the east. He crossed the irrigating ditch and gained the trail, the short-cut over into Los Muertos by way of Hooven's. It led south and west into the low ground overgrown by gray-green willows by Broderson Creek, at this time of the rainy season a stream of considerable volume, farther on dipping sharply to pass underneath the long trestle of the railroad. On the other side of the right-of-way, Annixter was obliged to open the gate in Derrick's line fence. He managed this without dismounting, swearing at the horse the while, and spurring him continually. But once inside the gate, he cantered forward briskly. This part of Los Muertos was Hooven's holding, some 500 acres enclosed between the irrigating ditch and Broderson Creek, and half the way across Annixter came up with Hooven himself, busily at work replacing a broken washer in his cedar. Upon one of the horses hitched to the machine, her hands gripped tightly upon the harness of the collar, Hilda, his little daughter, with her small hobnailed boots and boy's canvas overalls, sat, exalted and petrified with ecstasy and excitement, her eyes wide opened and her hair in a tangle. "Hello, Bismarck," said Annixter, drawing up beside him. "What are you doing here? I thought the governor was going to manage without his tenants this year." "Och, Mr. Annixter," cried the other, straightening up. "Och, that's you, eh? Och, you bet he don't manage without me. Me, I gotta stay. I talk der straight talk mit der governor. I fix 'em. Och, you bet. 7 year I have by der ranch gestopped. Yes, sir. Every other son of a gun by der place get der sack but me. Eh? What you think von those things?" "I think that's a crazy-looking monkey wrench you've got there," observed Annixter, glancing at the instrument in Hooven's hand. "Ach, dot wrench," returned Hooven. "So, well, I tell you those thing now where I got 'em. Say, you see dot wrench? That's not American wrench at all. I got 'em at Gravelot der day we licked der stuffin' out der French. Ach, you bet. Me, I belong to der Württemberg regiment dat they used to support der battery von der Prince von Hohenlohe. All of der day we lay down by der stomach in der field behind der battery, und der shells von der French cannon have explode. Ach, Donnerwetter, I think every shell explode by der backside my neck. Und dat go on der whole day, nodden else, nodden aber der French shell, brr, 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 bram, and der smoke, and unser battery, dat go off slow, steady, just like der clock. 1, 2, boom, 1, 2, boom, just like der clock, over and over again, all of der day. Then when der night come, they say we have great victory made. I don't know. What do I see von der battle? Nodden. Then we get up and march all a night, und in der morgen we hear those cannon again, hell off der way, far off. I don't know how ver. But never mind. Pretty quick, ach Gott, his face flamed scarlet. Ach, du lieber Gott. Pretty soon there was der Kaiser, close by, und Fritz, unser Fritz. By Gott, then I go crazy and yell, ach, you bet, der whole regiment. Ach, der Kaiser, ach, der Vaterland. Und der tears come to their eyes, I don't know because why, and der men's cry and shake their head, and their whole regiment march off like that, very proud, by Gott, their head up high, und sing Die Wacht am Rhein. Dot was Gravlot. And the monkey ranch? Ach, I pick 'em up when der battery go. Der cannoneers have forgot and leave 'em. I carry 'em in der sack. I think I use 'em when I get home in der business. I was maker von wagons in Karlsruhe, and I never get home again. When der war have got over, I go back to and get married, and then I get damn sick von der army. When I get der release, I clear out, you bet. I come to America. First New York, then Milwaukee, then Springfield, Illinois, then California, and here I stay. And the fatherland, ever want to go back? Well, I tell you those things, Mr. Annixter. Always I think lot of Germany, under Kaiser, and never I forget Gravlot. But, say, I tell you those things, where der wife is, under Kinder, der little girl Hilda, there is der Vaterland, eh? America, that's my country now, and there. He pointed behind him to the house under the mammoth oak tree on the lower road. That's my home. That's good enough Vaterland for me. Annixter gathered up the reins, about to go on. So you like America, do you, Bismarck? He said. Who do you vote for? America? I don't know, returned the other insistently. That's my home yonder. That's my Vaterland. Alle von we Germans, just like that. Germany, that's hell of some fine place, sure. But der Vaterland is where der home, und der wife, and der Kinder is. Eh, yes? Vote? Ach, no. Me, I never vote. I don't bother der head mit those things. I make der wheat grow, und get der bread for der wife and Hilda, that's all. That's me. That's Bismarck. Goodbye, commented Annixter, moving off. Hooven, the washer replaced, turned to his work again, starting up the horses. The cedar advanced, whirring. "Ach, Hilda, little girl," he cried. "Hold tight by der strap on. Hey, mule, whoop, get up, you." Annixter cantered on. In a few moments he had crossed Broderson Creek and had entered upon the home ranch of Los Muertos. Ahead of him, but so far off that the greater portion of its bulk was below the horizon, he could see the Derricks' home, a roof or two between the dull green of cypress and eucalyptus. Nothing else was in sight. The brown earth, smooth, unbroken, was as a limitless mud-colored ocean. The silence was profound. Then, at length, Annixter's searching eye made out a blur on the horizon to the northward. The blur concentrated itself to a speck. The speck grew by steady degrees to a spot, slowly moving, a note of dull color, barely darker than the land, but an inky black silhouette as it topped a low rise of ground and stood for a moment outlined against the pale blue of the sky. Annixter turned his horse from the road and rode across the ranch land to meet this new object of interest. As the spot grew larger, it resolved itself into constituents, a collection of units. Its shape grew irregular, fragmentary. A disintegrated, nebulous confusion advanced toward Annixter, preceded, as he discovered on nearer approach, by a medley of faint sounds. Now it was no longer a spot, but a column that moved, accompanied by spots. As Annixter lessened the distance, these spots resolved themselves into buggies or men on horseback that kept pace with the advancing column. There were horses in the column itself. At first glance it appeared as if there were nothing else, a riderless squadron tramping steadily over the upturned plough-land of the ranch. But it drew nearer. The horses were in lines, 6 abreast, harnessed to machines. The noise increased, defined itself. There was a shout or two. Occasionally a horse blew through his nostrils with a prolonged, vibrating snort. The click and clink of metalwork was incessant, the machines throwing off a continual rattle of wheels and cogs and clashing springs. The column approached nearer, was close at hand. The noises mingled to a subdued uproar, a bewildering confusion. The impact of innumerable hoofs was a veritable rumble. Machine after machine appeared, and Annixter, drawing to one side, remained for nearly 10 minutes watching and interested, while, like an array of chariots, clattering, jostling, creaking, clashing, an interminable procession, machine succeeding machine, 6-horse team succeeding 6-horse team, bustling, hurried, Magnus Derrick's 33 grain drills, each with its 8 hoes, went clamoring past, like an advance of military, seeding the 10,000 acres of the great ranch, fecundating the living soil, implanting deep in the dark womb of the earth the germ of life, the sustenance of a whole world, the food of an entire people. When the drills had passed, Annixter turned and rode back to the lower road, over the land now thick with seed. He did not wonder that the seeding on Los Muertos seemed to be hastily conducted. Magnus and Haran Derrick had not yet been able to make up the time lost at the beginning of the season, when they had waited so long for the plows to arrive. They had been behindhand all the time. On Annixter's ranch, the land had not only been harrowed as well as seeded, but in some cases cross-harrowed as well. The labor of putting in the vast crop was over. Now there was nothing to do but wait, while the seed silently germinated. Nothing to do but watch for the wheat to come up. When Annixter reached the ranch house of Los Muertos, under the shade of the cypress and eucalyptus trees, he found Mrs. Derrick on the porch, seated in a long wicker chair. She had been washing her hair, and the light brown locks that yet retained so much of their brightness were carefully spread in the sun over the back of her chair. Annixter could not but remark that, spite of her more than 50 years, Annie Derrick was yet rather pretty. Her eyes were still those of a young girl, just touched with an uncertain expression of innocence and inquiry, but as her glance fell upon him, he found that expression changed to one of uneasiness, of distrust, almost of aversion. The night before this, after Magnus and his wife had gone to bed, they had lain awake for hours, staring up into the dark, talking. Magnus had not long been able to keep from his wife the news of the coalition that was forming against the railroad, nor the fact that this coalition was determined to gain its ends by any means at its command. He had told her of Osterman's scheme of a fraudulent election to seat a board of railroad commissioners who should be nominees of the farming interests. Magnus and his wife had talked this matter over and over again, and the same discussion, begun immediately after supper the evening before, had lasted till far into the night. At once Annie Derrick had been seized with a sudden terror lest Magnus, after all, should allow himself to be persuaded, should yield to the pressure that was every day growing stronger. None better than she knew the iron integrity of her husband's character. None better than she remembered how his dearest ambition, that of political preferment, had been thwarted by his refusal to truckle, to connive, to compromise with his ideas of right. Now, at last, there seemed to be a change. Long-continued oppression, petty tyranny, injustice, and extortion had driven him to exasperation. S. Berman's insults still rankled. He seemed nearly ready to countenance Osterman's scheme. The very fact that he was willing to talk of it to her so often, and at such great length, was proof positive that it occupied his mind. The pity of it, the tragedy of it. He, Magnus, the governor, who had been so staunch, so rigidly upright, so loyal to his convictions, so bitter in his denunciation of the new politics, so scathing in his attacks on bribery and corruption in high places. Was it possible that now, at last, he could be brought to withhold his condemnation of the devious intrigues of the unscrupulous going on there under his very eyes? That Magnus should not command Haran to refrain from all intercourse with the conspirators had been a matter of vast surprise to Mrs. Derrick. Time was when Magnus would have forbidden his son to so much as recognize a dishonorable man. But besides all this, Derrick's wife trembled at the thought of her husband and son engaging in so desperate a grapple with the railroad. That great monster, iron-hearted, relentless, infinitely powerful. Always it had issued triumphant from the fight. Always S. Behrman, the corporation's champion, remained upon the field as victor, placid, unperturbed, unassailable. But now a more terrible struggle than any hitherto loomed menacing over the rim of the future. Money was to be spent like water. Personal reputations were to be hazarded in the issue. Failure meant ruin in all directions: financial ruin, moral ruin, ruin of prestige, ruin of character. Success, to her mind, was almost impossible. Annie Derrick feared the railroad. At night, when everything else was still, the distant roar of passing trains echoed across Los Muertos, from Guadalajara, from Bonneville, or from the Long Trestle, straight into her heart. At such moments she saw very plainly the galloping terror of steam and steel, with its single eye, cyclopean, red, shooting from horizon to horizon, symbol of a vast power, huge and terrible. The Leviathan with tentacles of steel, to oppose which meant to be ground to instant destruction beneath the clashing wheels. No, it was better to submit, to resign oneself to the inevitable. She obliterated herself, shrinking from the harshness of the world, striving with vain hands to draw her husband back with her. Just before Annixter's arrival, she had been sitting, thoughtful, in her long chair, an open volume of poems turned down upon her lap, her glance losing itself in the immensity of Los Muertos that, from the edge of the lawn close by, unrolled itself, gigantic, toward the far southern horizon, wrinkled and serrated after the season's plowing. The earth, hitherto gray with dust, was now upturned and brown. As far as the eye could reach, it was empty of all life, bare, mournful, absolutely still. And as she looked, there seemed to her morbid imagination, diseased and disturbed with long brooding, sick with the monotony of repeated sensation, to be disengaged from all this immensity, a sense of vast oppression, formless, disquieting. The terror of sheer bigness grew slowly in her mind. Loneliness beyond words gradually enveloped her. She was lost in all these limitless reaches of space. Had she been abandoned in mid-ocean in an open boat, her terror could hardly have been greater. She felt vividly that certain uncongeniality which, when all is said, forever remains between humanity and the earth which supports it. She recognized the colossal indifference of nature, not hostile, even kindly and friendly, so long as the human ant-swarm was submissive, working with it, hurrying along at its side in the mysterious march of the centuries. Let, however, the insect rebel strive to make head against the power of this nature, and at once it became relentless, a gigantic engine, a vast power, huge, terrible. A Leviathan with a heart of steel, knowing no compunction, no forgiveness, no tolerance. Crushing out the human atom with soundless calm, the agony of destruction sending never a jar, never the faintest tremor through all that prodigious mechanism of wheels and cogs. Such thoughts as these did not take shape distinctly in her mind. She could not have told herself exactly what it was that disquieted her. She only received the vague sensation of these things, as it were a breath of wind upon her face, confused, troublous, an indefinite sense of hostility in the air. The sound of hoofs grinding upon the gravel of the driveway brought her to herself again, and withdrawing her gaze from the empty plain of Los Muertos, she saw young Annixter stopping his horse by the carriage steps. But the sight of him only diverted her mind to the other trouble. She could not but regard him with aversion. He was one of the conspirators, was one of the leaders in the battle that impended. No doubt he had come to make a fresh attempt to win over Magnus to the unholy alliance. However, there was little trace of enmity in her greeting. Her hair was still spread, like a broad patch of brown seaweed, upon the white towel over the chair-back, and she made that her excuse for not getting up. In answer to Annixter's embarrassed inquiry after Magnus, she sent the Chinese cook to call him from the office. And Annixter, after tying his horse to the ring driven into the trunk of one of the eucalyptus trees, came up to the porch, and taking off his hat, sat down upon the steps. "Is Harron anywhere about?" he asked. "I'd like to see Harron, too." "No," said Mrs. Derrick. "Harron went to Bonneville early this morning." She glanced toward Annixter nervously, without turning her head, lest she should disturb her outspread hair. "What is it you want to see Mr. Derrick about?" she inquired hastily. "Is it about this plan to elect a railroad commission?" "Magnus does not approve of it," she declared with energy. "He told me so last night." Annixter moved about awkwardly where he sat, smoothing down with his hand the one stiff lock of yellow hair that persistently stood up from his crown like an Indian's scalp lock. At once his suspicions were all aroused. Ah, this female woman was trying to get a hold on him, trying to involve him in a petticoat mess, trying to cajole him. Upon the instant he became very crafty. An excess of prudence promptly congealed his natural impulses. In an actual spasm of caution, he scarcely trusted himself to speak, terrified lest he should commit himself to something. He glanced about apprehensively, praying that Magnus might join them speedily, relieving the tension. "I came to see about giving a dance in my new barn," he answered, scowling into the depths of his hat, as though reading from notes he had concealed there. "I wanted to ask how I should send out the invites. I thought of just putting an ad in the Mercury." But as he spoke, Presley had come up behind Annixter in time to get the drift of the conversation, and now observed, "That's nonsense, Buck. You're not giving a public ball. You must send out invitations." "Hello, Presley, you there?" exclaimed Annixter, turning round. The two shook hands. "Send out invitations?" repeated Annixter uneasily. "Why must I?" "Because that's the only way to do." "It is it?" answered Annixter, perplexed and troubled. No other man of his acquaintance could have so contradicted Annixter without provoking a quarrel upon the instant. Why the young rancher, irascible, obstinate, belligerent, should invariably defer to the poet was an inconsistency never to be explained. It was with great surprise that Mrs. Derrick heard him continue, "Well, I suppose you know what you're talking about, Press. Must have written invites, eh?" "Of course." "Typewritten?" "Why, what an ass you are, Buck," observed Presley calmly. "Before you get through with it, you will probably insult 3/4 of the people you intend to invite, and have about 100 quarrels on your hand and a lawsuit or two." However, before Annixter could reply, Magnus came out on the porch, erect, grave, freshly shaven. Without realizing what he was doing, Annixter instinctively rose to his feet. It was as though Magnus was a commander-in-chief of an unseen army, and he a subaltern. There was some little conversation as to the proposed dance, and then Annixter found an excuse for drawing the governor aside. Mrs. Derrick watched the two with eyes full of poignant anxiety as they slowly paced the length of the gravel driveway to the road gate, and stood there, leaning upon it, talking earnestly. Magnus, tall, thin-lipped, impassive, one hand in the breast of his frock-coat, his head bare, his keen blue eyes fixed upon Annixter's face. Annixter came at once to the main point. "I got a wire from Osterman this morning, Governor, and, well, we've got Disbrow. That means the Denver, Pueblo, and Mojave is back of us. There's half the fight won first off." "Osterman bribed him, I suppose," observed Magnus. Annixter raised a shoulder vexatiously. "You've got to pay for what you get," he returned. "You don't get something for nothing, I guess. Governor," he went on, "I don't see how you can stay out of this business much longer. You see how it will be. We're going to win, and I don't see how you can feel that it's right of you to let us do all the work and stand all the expense. There's never been a movement of any importance that went on around you that you weren't the leader in it. All Tulare County, all the San Joaquin, for that matter, knows you. They want a leader, and they are looking to you. I know how you feel about politics nowadays. But, Governor, standards have changed since your time. Everybody plays the game now as we are playing it, the most honorable men. You can't play it any other way, and pshaw, if the right wins out in the end, that's the main thing. We want you in this thing, and we want you bad. You've been chewing on this affair now a long time. Have you made up your mind? Do you come in? I tell you what, you've got to look at these things in a large way. You've got to judge by results. Well, now, what do you think? Do you come in?" Magnus' glance left Annixter's face, and for an instant sought the ground. His frown lowered, but now it was in perplexity rather than in anger. His mind was troubled, harassed with 1,000 dissensions. But one of Magnus' strongest instincts, one of his keenest desires, was to be, if only for a short time, the master. To control men had ever been his ambition, submission of any kind his greatest horror. His energy stirred within him, goaded by the lash of his anger, his sense of indignity, of insult. Oh, for one moment to be able to strike back, to crush his enemy, to defeat the railroad, hold the corporation in the grip of his fist, put down S. Berman, rehabilitate himself, regain his self-respect. To be once more powerful, to command, to dominate. His thin lips pressed themselves together, the nostrils of his prominent hawk-like nose dilated, his erect, commanding figure stiffened unconsciously. For a moment he saw himself controlling the situation, the foremost figure in his state, feared, respected, thousands of men beneath him, his ambition at length gratified. His career, once apparently brought to naught, completed, success a palpable achievement. What if this were his chance, after all, come at last after all these years? His chance. The instincts of the old-time gambler, the most redoubtable poker player of El Dorado County, stirred at the word. Chance. To know it when it came, to recognize it as it passed fleet as a wind flurry, grip at it, catch at it, blind, reckless, staking all upon the hazard of the issue. That was genius. Was this his chance? All of a sudden, it seemed to him that it was. But his honor, his cherished lifelong integrity, the unstained purity of his principles, at this late date were they to be sacrificed? Could he now go counter to all the firm-built fabric of his character? How afterward could he bear to look Harron and Lyman in the face? And yet, back swung the pendulum. To neglect his chance meant failure. A life begun in promise and ended in obscurity, perhaps in financial ruin, poverty even. To seize it meant achievement, fame, influence, prestige, possibly great wealth. "I am so sorry to interrupt," said Mrs. Derrick as she came up. "I hope Mr. Annixter will excuse me, but I want Magnus to open the safe for me. I have lost the combination, and I must have some money. Phelps is going into town, and I want him to pay some bills for me. Can't you come right away, Magnus? Phelps is ready and waiting." Annixter struck his heel into the ground with a suppressed oath. Always these fool female women came between him and his plans, mixing themselves up in his affairs. Magnus had been on the very point of saying something, perhaps committing himself to some course of action, and at precisely the wrong moment his wife had cut in. The opportunity was lost. The three returned toward the ranch house. But before saying goodbye, Annixter had secured from Magnus a promise to the effect that, before coming to a definite decision in the matter under discussion, he would talk further with him. Presley met him at the porch. He was going into town with Phelps, and proposed to Annixter that he should accompany them. "I want to go over and see old Broderson," Annixter objected. But Presley informed him that Broderson had gone to Bonneville earlier in the morning. He had seen him go past in his buckboard. The three men set off, Phelps and Annixter on horseback, Presley on his bicycle. When they had gone, Mrs. Derrick sought out her husband in the office of the ranch house. She was at her prettiest that morning, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her innocent, wide-open eyes almost girlish. She had fastened her hair, still moist, with a black ribbon tied at the back of her head, and the soft mass of light brown reached to below her waist, making her look very young. "What was it he was saying to you just now?" she exclaimed, as she came through the gate in the green-painted wire railing of the office. "What was Mr. Annixter saying? I know. He was trying to get you to join him, trying to persuade you to be dishonest. Wasn't that it? Tell me, Magnus, wasn't that it?" Magnus nodded. His wife drew close to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "But you won't, will you? You won't listen to him again. You won't so much as allow him, anybody, to even suppose you would lend yourself to bribery. Oh, Magnus, I don't know what has come over you these last few weeks. Why, before this, you would have been insulted if anyone thought you would even consider anything like dishonesty. Magnus, it would break my heart if you joined Mr. Annixter and Mr. Osterman. Why, you couldn't be the same man to me afterward, you who have kept yourself so clean till now. And the boys, what would Lyman say, and Harron, and everyone who knows you and respects you, if you lowered yourself to be just a political adventurer?" For a moment Derrick leaned his head upon his hand, avoiding her gaze. At length he said, drawing a deep breath, "I am troubled, Annie, These are the evil days. I have much upon my mind." "Evil days or not," she insisted, "promise me this one thing, that you will not join Mr. Annixter's scheme." She had taken his hand in both of hers and was looking into his face, her pretty eyes full of pleading. "Promise me," she repeated. "Give me your word. Whatever happens, let me always be able to be proud of you, as I always have been. Give me your word. I know you never seriously thought of joining Mr. Annixter, but I am so nervous and frightened sometimes. Just to relieve my mind, Magnus, give me your word." "Why, you are right," he answered. "No, I never thought seriously of it. Only for a moment I was ambitious to be, I don't know what I hoped to be once. Well, that is over now. Annie, your husband is a disappointed man." "Give me your word," she insisted. "We can talk about other things afterward." Again Magnus wavered, about to yield to his better instincts and to the entreaties of his wife. He began to see how perilously far he had gone in this business. He was drifting closer to it every hour. Already he was entangled. Already his foot was caught in the mesh that was being spun. Sharply he recoiled. Again all his instincts of honesty revolted. No, whatever happened, he would preserve his integrity. His wife was right. Always she had influenced his better side. At that moment, Magnus' repugnance of the proposed political campaign was at its pitch of intensity. He wondered how he had ever allowed himself to so much as entertain the idea of joining with the others. Now he would wrench free, would, in a single instant of power, clear himself of all compromising relations. He turned to his wife. Upon his lips trembled the promise she implored. But suddenly there came to his mind the recollection of his new-made pledge to Annixter. He had given his word that before arriving at a decision he would have a last interview with him. To Magnus his given word was sacred. Though now he wanted to, he could not as yet draw back, could not promise his wife that he would decide to do right. The matter must be delayed a few days longer. Lamely he explained this to her. Annie Derrick made but little response when he had done. She kissed his forehead and went out of the room, uneasy, depressed, her mind thronging with vague fears, leaving Magnus before his office desk, his head in his hands, thoughtful, gloomy, assaulted by forebodings. Meanwhile, Annixter, Phelps, and Presley continued on their way toward Bonneville. In a short time they had turned into the county road by the great watering tank and proceeded onward in the shade of the interminable line of poplar trees, the windbreak that stretched along the roadside bordering the Broderson ranch. But as they drew near to Carraher's saloon and grocery, about half a mile outside of Bonneville, they recognized Harron's horse tied to the railing in front of it. Annixter left the others and went in to see Harron. "Harron," he said, when the two had sat down on either side of one of the small tables, "you've got to make up your mind one way or another pretty soon. What are you going to do? Are you going to stand by and see the rest of the committee spending money by the bucketful in this thing and keep your hands in your pockets? If we win, you'll benefit just as much as the rest of us. I suppose you've got some money of your own. You have, haven't you? You are your father's manager, aren't you?" Disconcerted at Annixter's directness, Harron stammered an affirmative, adding, "It's hard to know just what to do. It's a mean position for me, Buck. I want to help you others, but I do want to play fair. I don't know how to play any other way. I should like to have a line from the governor as to how to act, but there's no getting a word out of him these days. He seems to want to let me decide for myself." "Well, look here," put in Annixter. "Suppose you keep out of the thing till it's all over, and then share alike with the committee on campaign expenses." Harron fell thoughtful, his hands in his pockets, frowning moodily at the toe of his boot. There was a silence. Then, "I don't like to go it blind," he hazarded. "I'm sort of sharing the responsibility of what you do, then. I'm a silent partner. And then, I don't want to have any difficulties with the governor. We've always got along well together. He wouldn't like it, you know, if I did anything like that." "Say," exclaimed Annixter abruptly, "if the governor says he will keep his hands off, and that you can do as you please, will you come in?" For God's sake, let us ranchers act together for once. Let's stand in with each other in one fight." Without knowing it, Annixter had touched the right spring. "I don't know but what you're right," Harron murmured vaguely. His sense of discouragement, that feeling of what's the use, was never more oppressive. All fair means had been tried. The wheat grower was at last with his back to the wall. If he chose his own means of fighting, the responsibility must rest upon his enemies, not on himself. "It's the only way to accomplish anything," he continued, "standing in with each other. Well, go ahead and see what you can do. If the governor is willing, I'll come in for my share of the campaign fund." "That's some sense," exclaimed Annixter, shaking him by the hand. "Half the fight is over already. We've got Disbrow, you know, and the next thing is to get hold of some of those rotten San Francisco bosses. Osterman will—" But Harron interrupted him, making a quick gesture with his hand. "Don't tell me about it," he said. "I don't want to know what you and Osterman are going to do. If I did, I shouldn't come in." Yet, for all this, before they said goodbye, Annixter had obtained Harron's promise that he would attend the next meeting of the committee, when Osterman should return from Los Angeles and make his report. Harron went on toward Los Muertos. Annixter mounted and rode into Bonneville. Bonneville was very lively at all times. It was a little city of some 20 or 30,000 inhabitants, where as yet the City Hall, the High School building, and the Opera House were objects of civic pride. It was well governed, beautifully clean, full of energy and strenuous young life of a new city. An air of the briskest activity pervaded its streets and sidewalks. The business portion of the town, centering about Main Street, was always crowded. Annixter, arriving at the post office, found himself involved in a scene of swiftly shifting sights and sounds. Saddle horses, farm wagons, the inevitable Studebakers, buggies gray with the dust of country roads, buckboards with squashes and grocery packages stowed under the seat, two-wheeled sulkies and training carts were hitched to the gnawed railings and zinc-sheathed telegraph poles along the curb. Here and there, on the edge of the sidewalk, were bicycles wedged into bicycle racks painted with cigar advertisements. Upon the asphalt sidewalk itself, soft and sticky with the morning's heat, was a continuous movement. Men with large stomachs, wearing linen coats but no vests, labored ponderously up and down. Girls in lawn skirts, shirt-waists, and garden hats went to and fro, invariably in couples, coming in and out of the drugstore, the grocery store, and haberdashers, or lingering in front of the post office, which was on a corner under the IOOF hall. Young men in shirt-sleeves, with brown wicker cuff protectors over their forearms and pencils behind their ears, bustled in front of the grocery store, anxious and preoccupied. A very old man, a Mexican, in ragged white trousers and bare feet, sat on a horse block in front of the barber shop, holding a horse by a rope around its neck. A Chinaman went by, teetering under the weight of his market baskets slung on a pole across his shoulders. In the neighborhood of the hotel, the Yosemite House, traveling salesmen, drummers for jewelry firms of San Francisco, commercial agents, insurance men, well-dressed, metropolitan, debonair, stood about cracking jokes or hurried in and out of the flapping white doors of the Yosemite bar-room. The Yosemite bus and city bus passed on the street, on the way from the morning train, each with its 2 or 3 passengers. A very narrow wagon, belonging to the Coal and Colmore Harvester Works, went by loaded with long strips of iron that made a horrible din as they jarred over the unevenness of the pavement. The electric car line, the city's boast, did a brisk business, its cars whirring from end to end of the street with a jangling of bells and a moaning plaint of gearing. On the stone bulkheads of the grass plat around the new City Hall, the usual loafers sat, chewing tobacco, swapping stories. In the park were the inevitable array of nursemaids, skylarking couples, and ragged little boys. A single policeman, in gray coat and helmet, friend and acquaintance of every man and woman in the town, stood by the park entrance, leaning an elbow on the fence post, twirling his club. But in the center of the best business block of the street was a 3-story building of rough brown stone, set off with plate glass windows and gold-lettered signs. One of these latter read, Pacific and Southwestern Railroad, Freight and Passenger Office, while another, much smaller, beneath the windows of the second story, bore the inscription, P&SW, Land Office.